In this video, you're going to learn all about how to test your Python library now using NBDev. Let's get into it. So NBDev makes it really easy in order to test your notebooks and library. All you have to do is go to your command line and type in NBDev test NBs, and you'll see a bunch of outputs. Don't worry about all of um, uh, this text and stuff like that. This has nothing to do with your library if you're receiving this. If you're not, then good for you. I believe this has some issue to do with the code spaces that I have uh, hooked up or some metadata, but it doesn't have to do with your library having any errors. So just scroll past all that and don't pay it any mind. And look for when you see things like error in and then a particular notebook where you have some output saying the code that had an error and the type of error and trace back for it. So how does this testing work? So when you test using NBDev, it treats every single cell in your notebook that has code in it. So either so regardless of whether or not it has an export tag, a hide tag, or whatnot, and it treats it and it runs it. If while running it, it has an error, it will print that out and show you where the error is occurring, what notebook and what cell that error occurred. And so right now we're receiving this error, standard in not implemented. So I looked into this a lot to try and find an easy way to fix this error. This error is happening because we have in our init player and also a couple other functions, we have this input function, which expects user input. However, when we're doing things like testing with NBDev, it's supposed to be automated, and so it's not expecting there to be any user input while doing the tests. And so what we're going to do to overcome this issue is just ignore it. And so I'm going to turn all of these um, cells where we call this code into Markdown so that NBDev doesn't run them. And so in VS Code, you can just tap on the this little button over here to switch it either to Markdown or to code. Oops. So here it's now in Markdown mode, and so this is treated as Markdown. I'm also going to do the same for this one here. And this one here, since it also expects their input. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save that, and I'm going to run NBDev test MBs. Ignore all of that, and now we have a new error. So let's go ahead, find it. So it says error in index.ipy NB. So if we go ahead and open that up, it's saying that it occurred in the following cell. So it's the cell that has from your lib.core. And it said module not found. So that's because we don't have any module named your lib. Our library is called NQ57 mages. So we should be able to change that, save, and rerun NBDev test notebooks. All right, so if you have no errors, you'll see a message saying all tests are passing, so everything's good. Well, no, obviously not, because we haven't actually added any tests. This was just to get us to a point where we can now start adding new tests. So the workflow for adding tests to your project in NBDev is going to be a lot different than other Python projects. So we're not going to be using anything like PyTest or Python's built-in unit test framework. What we're going to be doing is using the already existing power of Jupyter Notebooks, where we have our cells right here along to add in our tests directly to our library in the same notebook. So all the tests that belong to a particular module in your library are going to be present in that Jupyter Notebooks file. So the way that we're going to be doing that is that since NBDev separates both the things that are part of your library and other cells that aren't, since you don't have a export tag on them, we are going to both use these pieces as the documentation, which you saw in the previous video, as well as our tests. Since when we run NBDev test notebooks, these cells will also get ran along with our module code. So let me show you an example of how that's how this is gonna work. So as you can see, we're creating a new mage with a particular name from this mage class. So one way that we can test whether or not everything is working is to make sure that the variables inside this class are correctly set. So making sure that the name is Nathan, making sure that the max health is what we set it to, etc., etc. So what we can do is do assertions. So NBDev works purely on asserts. So here we're going to do an assert statement saying whether or not the mage.name is equal to Nathan. And so this will constitute a test in NBDev. So if I go ahead and save this notebook, now actually just go ahead and run NBDev to see whether or not our test is going to pass or not. And we see that it doesn't. So if we go here, we say that our test that we wrote in this library for this assert had an error. So the mage name is not equal to Nathan. So if we look here, we can see that I made a typo when implementing this to Nathan. So let's go ahead and set this up like a proper test case where we have our setup, our action, and assertion sections. So in the setup, you will have all the variables that you want to check for. So we're going to have a name, or the expected output is where we're putting in this section of the test. So the name we want to be is Nathan. We want the mage when it's defined to equal a particular max health, so 100 here in this case. And we want the ability to be a water ability that has 10 damage and is type water. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pass these in to our mage class. And then we're going to assert whether or not these are correctly set in our mage class that we wrote. Okay, so if we want, we can now go ahead and run NBDev test notebooks. And we see that everything's passing. But if you notice, we have a couple other things that this mage class is supposed to do. It's supposed to set our level to 1. It's also supposed to set our current health. So we should also test those things as well. So I'm going to go ahead and also do another assert mage that current health is equal to max health. Since I haven't taken any damage currently, it should be the same. And also I'm going to do an assert mage.level is equal to 1. So if I go ahead and run NBDev notebooks, and you can see we're still passing. Okay, so let's say that we want to also test a particular function in this mage class works. So what we can do, since we already have the mage created in this cell, and NBDev, since it works linearly per notebook, we can go ahead and test a function such as when a mage levels up. So if we call the level up command, we expect a couple things to happen. So the first thing that we're going to expect is that the mage's max health is going to be equal to um, um, their previous max health times 2, since they should be leveling up. So it should be 200. So instead of writing out that formula here, what I'm going to do is just add a new, I'm going to modify this max health in this cell to be 200 for us to check against. And I'm going to also check that the current health got updated as well. I'm also going to check whether or not our abilities damage got updated. So when you level up as a mage, your abilities damage should also increase. So ability damage is now, or should now equal 20. So we can go ahead and assert that I made that ability damage will equal to ability. And also we want to make sure that our mage.level is equal to 2. Go ahead on NBDev test notebooks. And we're all passing. Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy some of the other tests that I've written previously for the demon character, as well as the interaction between a when a person battles. So here I have checking to make sure that when we create a demon, all of their stats and stuff are correct. And then also, since we now have a demon, checking whether or not when we attack the demon that the demon's health goes down. And also, conversely, also having another test that checks when the demon attacks the mage, that the mage's health goes down. Go ahead and test those now and see whether or not everything's working. And we have an error. So let's go ahead and debug this. All right, so it's saying that the demon's current health does not equal the current health. So the reason for this is because remember when we leveled up all the way back here, and since our abilities damage changed to 20, that means that this person's current health would have gone to 90. Instead of changing that here, what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually just remake the character down here from scratch. Remake the mage so that well, I'll make it here. So I'll make a new mage here that's going to have only 10 ability damage, and that way this test should now be proper. And so that we don't have a dependency on the test cases. That might make it kind of hard to debug. Okay, so that seems to be working now. Awesome. So one thing that's also important with NBDev is this idea of continuous integration. Continuous integration is achieved through GitHub Actions. And essentially what continuous integration is the software practice that requires frequent committing of code to a shared repository. When you commit code to your repository, you can continuously build and test the code to make sure that the commit doesn't introduce any errors. When you make a change and you push that off to GitHub, what you can do with GitHub is activate a GitHub action that will do this idea of continuous integration by building the code that you just committed and testing it using NBDev to see whether or not all of the tests are still passing. If they're not, then that would mean that you need to roll back the changes that you just made, do some more debugging and stuff before you push again back to GitHub. And it really helps being able to have this continuous integration, since you can detect errors sooner. Since as soon as a change is made and pushed off to GitHub, you get a report from GitHub saying the error, what happened, and so this way you can better track down and manage these errors before maybe you find out a week later from a customer or something, and you sort of forgot what you've already committed, or if you've already made like 5 other commits, so tracking it down might be difficult to see which commit might have done the error. In a continuous integration, all commits are checked always, so you can find out exactly which commit introduced a new error. But again, it's only as good as the test that you make. So writing strong tests is very important, so you should always be thorough with the tests that you create. So with GitHub, the way that you set up continuous integration is using a YAML file that's under a particular directory in GitHub. This is already set up for you if you use the NBDev template. And what this will give you is a main.yaml in your .github/workflows directory in your repository. What's in here is the name of whatever the GitHub action is. So in this case, it's a continuous integration one. And also what's going to trigger this action to run. So here, this action to perform the building and testing of our commit is going to happen on any push or pull request that happens in your GitHub repository. And so what's going to happen is it's going to execute whatever these jobs are anytime these actions happen. And it's going to run on the latest Ubuntu version. It's going to perform a few actions that have already been created by other GitHub users. In particular, it's going to check out our code using this checkout action. Essentially, all this does is that it takes whatever current commit just happened in your repository, checks it out so that you can perform your testing and stuff on it. Additionally, there's this setup Python action, which just sets up installing and setting up the Python environment for you to run your code in. And so we're using both of those. The first one's going to check out our code. The second one's going to set up Python for us. And specifically, it's using this with clause to say that we're going to be testing against Python 3.6 with a x64 architecture. And then what's going to happen next is a bunch of commands that's going to first install the library. So this is just doing a couple pip installs to get our necessary dependencies that NBDev requires. So first it's going to be NBDev, then Jupyter, and then it's going to install our library locally using -e. Then it's going to read the notebooks to see whether or not they are readable and not corrupt. It's also going to make sure that our notebooks are clean. This is an important note. If you have seen this error happen, where it says detected unstripped out notebooks, remember to run NBDev install GitHub notebook githooks. Make sure to run this in your console. So I'm going to go ahead and run this real fast, because what this does is that since Jupyter Notebooks contain a lot of metadata and stuff. That stuff usually has issues when being version controlled, since you'll have a bunch of merge conflicts with this metadata. And so this basically sets up a Git hook that every time you commit code, that it will clear out that metadata so that you don't have merge conflicts happening. And so that makes it a lot easier for the CI tool to test your notebooks. Then it's going to check whether or not there's a difference between your library, so the thing that you export to Python modules, and the notebooks yourself. There shouldn't be any difference, because if there is a difference, there might be an issue where the library that you exported does not reflect the same logic and functionality as what's going to be tested, which is your actual notebooks. So if those aren't the same, you're going to not be correctly testing your library. And then finally, it's going to run the tests. So it's going to run the command nb test notebooks, and we're going to get a report out for any failures that happened along the way while this action was taking place. So to view whether or not an action is what's happening in an action, all you have to do is go to your repository and click on the Actions tab. And here you'll see a bunch of different runs, depending on how many times you've committed to your repository. Most likely, most of them, almost all of them, will have failed, since we haven't properly done any of this testing and proper setting up of the continuous integration. And so, for example, if I go to this one, you can see that we have the action that was performed. So it was everything that was in the the main.yaml file. And so if I click on that, we can look at the error that occurred. So it was an error due to us not cleaning out the metadata from our notebooks. We've gone ahead and cleaned out all of that metadata. We should go ahead and now be able to push and not have that error occur. I'm going to go ahead and do a git add -a to add everything, and commit add tests. I'm going to push it. And if I go ahead back to my library, my repo, and select actions, you'll see that a new one has spun up. And there's a couple different icons that you can see. This one that's in yellow is saying that it's currently being ran. If there's an X, a red X, then it means the run failed, so there's an error that occurred. And if everything passed, you'll see a green check mark. So let me go ahead and go to this run, go to the build, and let's see what it's currently doing. Okay, so all of these ones that have check marks mean that that they passed. So the setup job passed, running the checkout, running the setups tool, installing the library worked, reading the notebooks worked. We also properly cleaned our notebooks now. So we moved past that error that we had previously. There was no difference between our library and notebooks, since we only really added tests. We didn't change any of the logic in our notebooks when we exported them. So there was no difference between the library and our notebooks in that respect. And all of our tests passed when we ran the tests. And so we have now a green check mark. So if we go to our code, we can see another green check mark here, which says that this commit that we just performed passed our continuous integration. If we go to this history on one that's next to the green check mark, this will show you the different commits. You can see that these previous commits that I had a red check mark, meaning that they didn't get passed. And so this also helps people who are visiting your repository to see whether or not you have tests, for one, and whether or not when you're updating your library and stuff, whether or not they can just easily clone down the library without having any errors currently since they can just check that everything's being passed in your repository. All right, so that does it for this video. You now have a NBDev project with proper documentation and tests. The next video is going to be how to publish it to PyPi. I hope you're looking forward to it. If you liked the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you disliked it, give it a thumbs down. And if you have any comments, suggestions, recommendations, etc., leave them down in the comment section below, and subscribe if you want more content like this.